All right, so get this. We're going to be diving deep into Eminem's studio albums
Okay.
to figure out which ones have the most globally recognizable songs.
Interesting.
We're using a top 10 list from the top10s.com for this deep dive.
Right.
But we're going to be going way beyond just, like listing the hits.
Okay.
And one kind of interesting thing is this list only looks at studio albums.
Really?
No compilations allowed.
Why not?
Well, think about it. Including compilations like Curtain Call would be kind of like stacking the deck.
Yeah, I guess so.
It's a lot more interesting to see which studio albums just organically produced these massive hits we all know.
Right, like which ones have just natural staying power.
Exactly. The songs everyone seems to recognize no matter what.
Yeah, makes sense.
So where does this list take us? Well,
Let's hear it.
the #1 spot goes to
What is it?
The Eminem Show.
Oh, wow.
I mean, does this one even need an explanation?
It's a loaded with hits, for sure.
Right.
Sing for the moment. Without me cleaning out my closet, I mean, those are practically inescapable.
You're telling me, and those are just like the tip of the iceberg?
Yeah, what else?
You've got Till I Collapse, which has become like a workout anthem for like everyone.
For real.
And let's not forget Superman.
Oh, yeah, good one.
Another track from that album that still holds up today.
Totally.
But why do you think The Eminem Show resonated so strongly with audiences?
Well, it came out in 2002.
Right.
A time when Eminem was already a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
But this album felt different.
In what way?
It had this rawness and vulnerability that people hadn't really heard from him before, He was addressing his personal struggles, his relationship with his mother, his fame, all while still delivering those incredibly sharp rhymes.
It was like he was letting us in a little bit,
Yeah.
showing us the man behind the Slim Shady persona.
Right.
And I think that resonated with people on a much deeper level.
Absolutely. He was also experimenting with different sounds on The Eminem Show.
Like what?
You hear rock influences in songs like Sing for the Moment,
Yeah.
which broadened his appeal even further.
Okay, coming in at #2 is Recovery.
Interesting.
Now, this one marked a pretty big shift for Eminem,
Yeah, how so?
both personally and musically.
Okay.
It came after Relax,
Right.
an album where he was still grappling with addiction
Uh-huh.
and kind of experimenting with a different style.
Yeah, Relapse was definitely a more experimental phase.
Right.
But with Recovery, it felt like Eminem was coming back stronger, more focused,
Yeah.
The album had a more pop-oriented sound,
Okay.
which some saw as a departure from his earlier work.
But those pop elements brought in a whole new wave of fans.
That's true.
I mean, Love the Way You Lie, his collaboration with Rihanna,
Huge hit.
became a monster hit.
For sure.
And Not Afraid was another massive success with a really powerful message of resilience.
Right. Those songs became anthems.
Definitely.
But it's interesting to think about the trade-offs.
Like what?
Did that move toward a more commercial sound compromise some of the raw energy and lyrical complexity that drew people to Eminem in the first place? The question worth considering.
Definitely. It's like there's always this tension
There is.
between artistic integrity and commercial success.
Yeah.
Especially in hip-hop.
For sure.
But regardless of your take on that, Recovery really solidified Eminem's dominance in the early 2010s.
No doubt about it. Topped charts worldwide and earned him a ton of awards.
Okay, let's talk about the album that claims the title of Eminem's biggest ever,
Right.
the Marshall Mathers LP.
That's a big one.
This one is a true classic packed with songs that practically defined a generation.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about catchy hooks either,
Right.
There was real depth to the lyrics, to storytelling.
The Marshall Mathers LP was a game changer.
Totally.
It pushed boundaries, challenged social norm, sparked endless controversy. But it was also brilliantly crafted.
It really was.
You have Stan, which practically invented a new word for obsessive fandom.
It did?
And then The Real Slim Shady is a satirical masterpiece that skewers celebrity culture.
It's almost like two sides of the same coin.
How so?
The dark, introspective storytelling of Stan,
Right.
and then the in-your-face humor of The Real Slim Shady.
I see it.
And the album is filled with other tracks that showcase Eminem's range and just lyrical genius.
Yeah, like what?
Kill You, Criminal the Way I Am.
Oh, yeah.
Each one is a statement.
It's not just about individual songs, though.
What else?
The Marshall Mathers LP had a cohesive narrative, this raw energy that captured a specific moment in time.
Okay.
It was angry, provocative, and unapologetically Eminem.
And it still resonates today.
It does.
Even with listeners who weren't even born when it came out.
That's the mark of a truly iconic album.
I think so, too.
It's an album you can revisit over and over, and you'll always find something new to discover.
Okay, so we've covered the heavy hitters.
The big three.
The top 3 albums on this list
Right.
of Eminem's most recognizable music.
Got it.
But there are still 7 more albums to unpack.
Wow.
And believe me, things get even more interesting as we dive deeper into his discography.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
Let's do it.
All right.
Okay, so let's move into the middle of the pack here.
The middle of the pack.
On this list of Eminem's most recognizable albums.
Gotcha.
This is where things get a little more nuanced, right?
Definitely, yeah. We're getting into albums that might not be packed with like wall-to-wall hits, you know?
Right.
But they still hold significant weight in his overall journey.
Exactly. It's like each one represents a different chapter.
It does.
In his musical evolution.
Right.
Take the Slim Shady LP, for example.
Okay. His
debut. Yeah, it's his debut album, the one that introduced the world to Slim Shady.
Right.
But surprisingly, the source doesn't actually call out specific songs as being super well known.
That's kind of interesting, isn't it, considering its impact?
Right.
I mean, this is the album that really put Eminem on the map, with its raw energy and, like, often shocking content.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, this was 1999.
Right.
Like, no one was really doing what Eminem was doing at that time.
It was like a cultural explosion.
Totally.
He was pushing boundaries and challenging the status quo.
Uh-huh.
And that's what, like, grabbed everyone's attention.
Yeah.
So even if individual songs from the Slim Shady LP aren't necessarily as, like, ingrained in our selective memory as some of his later hits,
Okay.
The album itself had a seismic impact on hip-hop and pop culture as a whole.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
It's more about the overall impression it left rather than, like, specific tracks.
Okay.
It was a statement of arrival.
Right.
A declaration that Eminem was a force to be reckoned with.
Exactly.
All
right, moving on, we have the Marshall Mathers LP2.
Okay.
Which came out much later in his career. It was almost like a revisiting of his earlier work.
It was.
But with a more mature perspective.
It's fascinating how he always plays with this idea of revisiting his past selves, even in his album idols.
Yeah.
The Marshall Mathers LP2 definitely had that element of, like, looking back while also pushing forward.
For sure. And what about Rap God?
Oh, yeah.
That song from MMLP2 became a viral sensation.
It did.
Because of its sheer technicality.
Oh, yeah.
Those lightning-fast verses had everyone trying to keep up.
Right. It was a reminder of his lyrical dexterity,
Yeah.
his ability to just, like, bend words and rhyme schemes to his will.
Right.
But beyond the technical skill, the Marshall Mathers LP2 also showed his growth as a songwriter.
In what way?
It wasn't all just shock value and aggression anymore.
Right.
There was more introspection, more vulnerability.
Yeah, like Headlights, where he apologized to his mother.
Right.
Showed a totally different side of him.
It did.
And then you had The Monster, his second collaboration with Rihanna.
Oh, yeah.
Which became another massive hit.
Huge.
Speaking of collaborations, the Marshall Mathers LP2 also had some interesting pairings.
Like
Love Game with Kendrick Lamar.
Oh, yeah.
Which I feel like highlighted this passing of the torch to a new generation of hip-hop stars.
Yeah, it did.
Okay, let's talk about Encore.
Encore, okay.
Now, this album was interesting.
In what way?
Because it's often considered one of Eminem's weaker efforts.
It's important to remember the context here.
Okay.
This was a period when Eminem was really battling addiction.
Right.
And that definitely seeped into the music.
Yeah.
In his own words, Encore, I was on drugs, relax, I was flushing them out.
So Encore was almost like a snapshot of that turbulent time in his life.
It was.
It wasn't necessarily his most polished work.
Right.
But it was raw and honest in it in one way.
Exactly. And even though it might not be considered one of his strongest albums overall, it still had some memorable moments,
Like what?
Mockingbird, for example, is a really heartfelt track dedicated to his daughter, Haley.
Right.
And it resonated with a lot of listeners.
And then there's, like, Toy Soldiers.
Oh, yeah.
Which tackled the issue of hip-hop feuds and violence,
Right.
It showed that even amidst his personal struggles, Eminem was still grappling with these important social issues.
Encore was also the album that gave us Yellow Brick Road.
Oh, yeah.
A deeply personal track where he addresses accusations of homophobia.
Wow.
And delves into his early influences. It was a moment of self-reflection and vulnerability that kind of hinted at the artistic evolution to come.
And let's not forget that Encore was re-released as Relax X Refill.
Oh, right.
Which included the track Forever.
Yeah.
This collaboration with Drake, Kanye West, and Lil Wayne.
Huge hit.
Became a huge hit and definitely gave the album a second wind.
It's almost like Encore has this complicated legacy. It was flawed and messy.
Yeah.
But it also contained these glimpses of brilliance and showed us a different side of Eminem.
Okay.
It's an album that deserves to be reevaluated.
Yeah.
In light of his later work.
Speaking of Relax.
Okay.
It's interesting how this album, which directly followed Encore,
Right.
Takes a much darker and more experimental approach.
It does. Relapse is a fascinating album.
Okay.
Because it's so clearly a product of his state of mind at the time.
Okay.
He was fresh out of rehab, grappling with the psychological and physical effects of addiction.
Wow.
And the music reflects that struggle.
How so?
It's dark, twisted, and often unsettling.
Really?
He was also experimenting with different vocal styles and accents on Relapse.
Oh, wow.
Which was a departure from his previous work.
Yeah.
It was a divisive album.
It was.
With some praising its ambition and others criticizing its shock value.
But even if it wasn't everyone's cup of tea, Relax showed that Eminem was willing to take risks and push himself creatively.
Right.
Even if it meant alienating some fans.
Yeah.
It was a bold statement, and it paved the way for his later work, where I think he found a better balance between his darker impulses and his desire to create meaningful music.
You can see the seeds of recovery being planted in Relax.
Really?
He was still working through a lot of personal demons.
Yeah.
But there were these moments of clarity and self-awareness that hinted at the direction he was heading in.
And those moments of self-awareness really shine through in Beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
A track from Relax that stands out for its vulnerability and honesty.
Right.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope for redemption and recovery. All right, so we've explored like the top half of this list.
The top half.
But there's still more to uncover.
Right.
We're getting into some of Eminem's later albums now.
Okay.
And it's fascinating to see how his sound and themes have evolved.
They have.
You know, as he's kind of entered this new phase of his career.
Yeah, for sure.
So what's next on this list of his most recognizable albums?
Okay, next up is Kamikaze.
Kamikaze.
Which was a surprise release back in 2018.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Remember this is after Revival?
Uh-huh.
An album that received kind of mixed reviews.
It did.
With some criticizing its more pop-oriented sound and like the political themes. Kamikaze felt like a direct response to those criticisms.
It did. It was like he was reclaiming his territory, you know?
Yeah.
Reminding everyone that he's still one of the most skilled rappers out there.
Right.
And the lead single, Venom, was unavoidable.
It was.
Even if you weren't an Eminem fan, you probably heard that song everywhere.
You probably did. Venom was definitely catchy, but it was more than just a radio hit.
Right.
The lyrics were full of that sharp wit and aggressive wordplay that he's known for.
Totally.
It was a statement of intent.
It was.
And it set the tone for the rest of the album.
I remember when Kamikaze dropped.
Yeah.
There was so much buzz online.
There was.
People were like debating the lyrics, dissecting the production, arguing about whether it was a return to form or a departure from his classic sound.
Right. That's what's so interesting about Eminem, you know? He's always been able to spark conversation and provoke strong reactions.
Yeah.
And Kamikaze definitely did that.
For sure.
It also showcased his ability to adapt to the changing landscape of hip-hop.
Like how?
Incorporating trap elements, collaborating with younger artists like Joyner Lucas.
And let's not forget The Ringer.
Oh, yeah.
Which was basically Eminem's response to the whole mumble rap trend.
It was a lyrical onslaught.
It was.
Just a display of technical skill that reminded everyone of his mastery of the craft.
It's almost like he was saying, look, I can still do this better than anyone.
Right.
And he made a compelling case for that on Kamikaze.
He did.
Now, here's where things get interesting.
Okay.
Music to be Murdered By, which came out in 2020, is completely absent from this list.
Interesting.
Of Eminem's most recognizable albums.
It is a bit surprising considering it's a relatively recent album.
Right.
Maybe it's a case of it being too new.
Yeah.
To have truly cemented its place in the cultural landscape.
Okay.
Or perhaps some of the songs will gain recognition over time. Who knows?
It's hard to say for sure.
It is.
But it does make you wonder, what makes an Eminem song truly recognizable? You know?
Right.
Is it about chart performance, critical acclaim, cultural impact?
Yeah.
Or is it something more intangible?
Okay.
Like a connection that resonates with listeners on a deeper level?
That's the question we've been exploring throughout this whole deep dive, isn't it?
We have.
And there's no easy answer.
Right.
It's a complex interplay of factors, and it's different for every listener.
Exactly. But even if Music to be Murdered By hasn't produced those massive, inescapable hits yet, you know?
Yeah.
It's still a significant album in his discography.
It is.
It shows his continued willingness to experiment and evolve.
Right.
Even as he enters his 50s.
And it's packed with lyrical gems and thought-provoking themes.
Totally.
It's an album that rewards close listening and repeated plays.
Okay, and finally at the bottom of this list.
The bottom, okay.
We have a rather surprising entry.
What is?
The Death of Slim Shady, Coup de Grace.
Oh, wow.
This album was just released.
It was.
So it's pretty wild to see it included here.
It definitely raises some eyebrows, right?
It does.
But the source specifically mentions the lead single, Houdini,
as
being like incredibly popular right now.
Houdini has definitely made a splash.
Yeah.
It's got that classic Eminem energy.
It does.
With hard-hitting lyrics and a catchy hook.
For sure.
And it's been generating a lot of buzz online.
It'll be interesting to see how the rest of the album performs over time.
Right.
Will those other tracks become as well known as Houdini?
Yeah, who knows?
Only time will tell.
This is like a great example of how this whole most recognizable concept is constantly evolving.
Yeah,
you know,
it is.
what's popular today might fade into obscurity tomorrow,
right?
While a seemingly overlooked track can suddenly become an anthem years later.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that music is a living, breathing thing,
Yeah,
you know?
it is.
It interweaves the culture, it shapes our experiences, and it continues to evolve long after it's released.
So what does it all mean?
What does it all mean?
We've journeyed through Eminem's discography.
We have.
From his explosive debut to his latest release. And we've seen how his sound, his themes, and his impact on culture has shifted over time.
It's been a fascinating exploration of what makes an artist's work resonate with millions of listeners across generations.
It has.
We've seen how Eminem has challenged norms, pushed boundaries, and sparked countless conversations through his music.
And even though we started with a list of his most recognizable albums, I think we've gone beyond simply ranking his work.
I think so too.
We've delved into the complexities of his artistry.
We have.
The controversies he's ignited and the lasting impact he's had on hip-hop and popular culture.
And ultimately it comes down to this.
What's that?
What resonates with you?
Yeah.
Which Eminem songs or albums have left a mark on your life? That's the real measure of his enduring legacy.
Beautifully said. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the music of Eminem.
It's been fun.
It's been a wild ride, and we hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. 16 2071